as you will have seen, a participant in the film and a genocide survivor, but he's also an indexer and cataloguer for the Genocide Archive in Rwanda. And Catherine Gilbert, who of course, for those who were at the panel before, needs no introduction really, but nonetheless, in case you weren't, she is a Marie Curie postdoc research fellow at the University of Ghent. So I thought the way that we could do this was, I was going to ask a couple of questions of our panelists to start with, and then open it up to the floor in case you had any questions yourself. So if it's okay to start with you, Piotr. I wondered if you could explain to us what your motivations were for making this extraordinary and accomplished film.
Do this. Yeah. Thank you very much for that lovely introduction, and thank you everyone for still being here in this heat. So the motivations for making the film were multiple. It came out of probably about a decade of looking at Rwanda, of going to Rwanda, and of thinking about the different ways in which images relate to the genocide against the Tutsi and its commemoration, and it's a very complex relationship. So I'm going to focus on the kind of main three reasons. So the reason why I say that the relationship between the genocide and images is complicated, but because people seem to have a lot of theories about that connection, and a lot of them quite contradictory. So on the one hand side, the genocide has been described as genocide without images. And the reason for it is that there are no or very few images of the actual genocide or killings. So there's one famous piece of footage recorded by Nick Hughes from the top of the French school in Kigali showing the death of 3 people. So that's the genocide without images bit. And then on the other hand, internationally at least, the genocide was mediated completely through images. There were a particular type of images with the representational tropes of non-Western world, so images of suffering, images of anonymous bodies, images of victimhood, but actually also in a historical sense very complex images, because the majority of the images were taken in the refugee camps in what used to be Zaire, or in Burundi or in Tanzania. So that was an event that was connected to the genocide, but also very separate from it. But these images came to signify this. So what I wanted to do with the film is to challenge the idea of the genocide image, because there is a certain very Western expectation of evidence, of pictorial evidence of violence. But actually, to people who lived through it, this isn't the importance of having the records on image of how your loved ones died. The genocide image, the most important image, is how they were they were alive. And I thought that was an intervention that hadn't happened in the Rwandan context, which is why it was important to make the film. The second reason was that I wanted to do something that shows Rwandans as active consumers and users of images, not just their subjects, and most of the time they're most of the time anonymous subjects. So we had lots of red lines, kind of formal red lines for the film, something, for instance, like no voiceover. So another kind of representational trope, especially when it comes to documentaries about Rwanda, is that the voices of the survivors are used to illustrate wider points made by either academics or journalists or someone connected with the kind of, I suppose, more traditional sense of authority. I really wanted to avoid that. Everyone was able to choose the language they speak in as well, which again is a significant thing, especially in a country like Rwanda where the population had been mobile for many years. So yeah, maybe I stop at 2 because I don't want to. There were lots of other reasons, but I think those are the 2 main ones. Maybe they'll come up later. I log off, right?
I think so. We have a complicated sound system up here. We can always return to that. I mean, I think one of the clear contributions that the film makes is an intervention in giving people voice. And I was wondering, Catherine, because your work similarly does the same. So what kind of resonances you see in your own work with testimonies and Piotr's work here, particularly in terms of giving women voice, issues around agency, and remembering practices.
I might borrow this microphone. Yeah, every time I watch this film, I always find more and more resonances, I think, between our own work. And I think what really comes through is the importance of storytelling and narrative, and how I think what this film does beautifully is sort of complicating our understanding of the ways in which narratives can be told, so using different media to tell stories. But it's really underlining the importance of finding a way of telling stories in one's own way. So, and I'm thinking about sort of collaborative research here, sort of giving someone a platform to be able to tell their story in the way that they want to tell it. And again, in this film, I think is something. So I'm working with written text mainly, and written texts are very much constructed in a quite a private manner. So you can go away, you have time to think about doing the writing, think about what you want to say, and something that comes through in this film is that the fact that these women are very clearly prepared what they want to say and how they want to talk about these images, but also how they want to physically present themselves to the audience. So I find that fascinating. But also I would just like to say one very brief thing to connect it to my current research on commemorative practices in diasporic communities. And I think that it was Paul, your comment in the film about sharing, was it Claver or Paul who mentioned about sharing an image online?
That was Claver.
Yeah, and the fact that sort of sets off a whole chain of dialogue and discussion, this connection of stories. And something I found fascinating when I was attending a commemoration in Namur in Belgium a few weeks ago was that there was a vigil after the official commemoration ceremony, and during that time they projected a slideshow of images that they'd collected from survivors in that community, and they just kept scrolling through these images until someone in the room saw someone that they recognized and wanted to talk about that person. So just the way these images generate memories and allow people to share stories, I think is fascinating.
Thank you, Catherine. I mean, if I can turn to you, Paul, now as somebody who was part of that film and somebody who has engaged in your own personal photographs with that film, I just wondered if you could talk through what your experience of, firstly, your involvement in the film, but also your involvement with the archive has been, in terms of your own remembering practices.
Oh, okay. Thank you. Normally in the archive, I'm in charge of audiovisual materials. And my colleague, Aline, whom you've seen in the film, is in charge of taking care of photographs. And when Piotr approached me and said he wanted to produce a film about the photograph, I was not willing to participate. And then he explained the project, and then I realized, this is the thing, this is the kind of thing that we do every day. So maybe I should help him, and I should participate, and and listen to the questions that he was going to ask. And then I was reluctant even to share my story with my family, and because I didn't see the interest, to the bigger audience. And then after the film, that's when I realized that, it's making impact. It did even inspire me to really take care of, photographs and other materials, like, and look at my family, because I left with a few pictures of my father, only one picture of my mother, whom you've seen in the film, and other siblings, I don't have their pictures. And then this film, when it was finished, I was emotional. and I realized how powerful, it is, and how pictures can make an impact on lives of specific survivors, and then after that I adopted new ways of, now I have a lot of pictures of my daughters. I have 2 daughters and a wife, and I make sure that every moment, funny moments, important moments are captured, because I say, you never know. And the way the genocide happened as a surprise for us, who were, that just teens, and tomorrow I might, I might die, and maybe without leaving behind something for souvenir for my family. And I make sure that I take videos of my daughters playing with me, and messages. So I can say, like, the Piotr's work really inspired me a lot, And for the work I do, it's a routine. Like, I try to be as professional as I can, and taking care of the pictures of our audience, of survivors who come to us, and trying to improve the good practices, best practices of preservation.
Thank you. That's, I mean, it's interesting to hear that, because one of the questions that this film raises for me, and also having spoken to you and thinking about Catherine's work too, is the extent to which we as scholars or archivists are actually engaged in a kind of co-creation of remembering practices with the very communities with whom we engage. And the extent to which, firstly, what might be happening if we weren't doing that, but also whether there are relative ethical challenges and questions around the kind of co-creation of our interventions within those communities, some of which may be beneficial or not. So I'm going to now turn that to all 3 of you, and ask if, before we turn to the audience, and ask if you have any comments to make to that. Should we start with you, Catherine? Because then I can just turn there.
Yeah, so many. I suppose that's something I'm thinking about all the time in my own work. So, and thinking about the book, I was sort of quite nervous about putting it out there, because you sort of think, well, okay, I'm a white British female academic, and what right do I have to tell this story? Am I appropriating, manipulating in some form this story? And that's what I was really interested in this idea of collaboration in the writing of the testimonies. So to what extent are these collaborative writing processes beneficial, enriching, or potentially dangerous? Because I actually talked to one woman who said she felt that the interestingly, a male journalist, the journalist she was working with, was trying to appropriate her story, and he wanted to put in a lot more explanatory material, and he wanted his name on the front cover, and she didn't want that. So I think this is something we need to be thinking about all of the time. I think I'll stop there, because I think it's already, yeah.
Okay. Paul, Piotr, would you like to respond to that?
Is that Paul or me?
Paul?
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
So when we have researchers at the memorial, we have experience with interviewees, because they always ask how the research is going. So they want always to be updated, but also they want like a follow-up. And that's why in our practices, we make sure that when we take a testimony for the archive, so we make sure that we promise that we would deliver a copy. We would provide a copy to interview, so that they can keep for themselves and for their children, because they say, I don't, as Esther explained, not many Rwandans like to writing down their stories, to publish, no, but they would love someone like Piotr or any Rwandan to come and take like images, like audiovisual images that they can keep. And then they say, yo, it's beautiful, I see myself. That's something that can be preserved for 50, 100 years. And then, you know, it's only one. Like I'm speaking, my image is seen, and when I'm dead, I will keep being seen in Rwanda and abroad. And so they are happy to have like researchers, mostly like audiovisual, something that they can see, and that's why, you know, when they have someone like when even recently we have had like a screening in Kigali with Zoe Norwich, and you know, a lot of people came, like a young audience came to see the film, and then they were impressed, and then they recommended us even something that we didn't think before, like they say, could you do sketches, like portraits, like drawings of people? There are some specialists in the sketches that you can imagine how someone looked like, and then draw, and then keep that as a souvenir. And now the artificial intelligence is there to, you know, to help us. Like, there are a lot of ideas, you know, came in. Like people are, you know, really thinking about it because of the film, and say there's solutions. There are a lot of solutions, like artificial intelligence. They can even create people who are dead like 50 years ago. Like you can just tell how someone looked like, and then you can have like a face. And then, you know, we'll say, this is something you can explore, you know. Yeah.
Before I answer, so the idea of sketches or getting sketch artists so it's weird because it came up as an idea from the audience at so many different screenings in different contexts. In Kigali, I think when we screened in Estonia, someone mentioned it as well. And I have to say, and this is not a discussion for now, I will get to your question, but I don't think, I'm really nervous about the idea of that, both AI and sketching. I think, but we can have a conversation about it maybe some other time. But to the question, so two things. First of all, there is a power imbalance. There is a representational power imbalance. I'm not going to get away from the fact that I'm a white bloke with masses of privilege, both historical and personal. So I think the only way in which you can address is our mitigating strategies. And I would kind of mention three, and I'm not saying that they're the only ones, or indeed that they're effective. You know, what I was saying about giving people a voice in the film and showing Rwandans as users, right, and subjects of images, you would be absolutely in the right for saying, well, that's all fine, but you have made that film and if you edited it and you've got the ultimate control about that story is told. I recognize that hypocrisy to a certain extent. But I suppose is what it's about for me is making this useful rather than completely paralyzing in sense, well, then I shouldn't do anything. So, and especially in relation to the creation of this testimonial or memorial moment, because you're putting someone in front of the camera and you're asking them to do something, perhaps they would do it in their own time as well, but not in that form, not with that level of formality. So it is a manufactured situation to a certain extent. So one of the things that was really important to me with this, in particular, as a kind of concrete example, there was a time, kind of around the 2010 or 2004 10th anniversary of the genocide, and then that a lot of film work started being done in Rwanda. And this is not to criticize fellow filmmakers. There are so many practical contingencies, budgets, you essentially turn up for a week and then you get the story, and especially if you're working, and then you leave. That's kind of what we do. I had the luxury of a much longer engagement, but that was a luxury. But what was happening increasingly, that people wanted to, with very good intentions, report this story both of horror but also of resilience and so on. And they were asking a lot of very direct questions, because these narratives had to have very kind of direct messages, especially if you were going to put it to an audience that, you know, didn't know what happened. And Rwanda, I mean, is making some progress, but in general doesn't have much in terms of mental health provision, especially outside of Kigali. So people cope with stuff in whatever way people cope with stuff. Some people talk about it, some people repress it, some people don't. There are a number of other kind of, not psychological, but social connections with it, about stigma, about, say, some of the things that Esther was talking about. So people would come in for a few days and ask these questions, and very often leave people re-traumatized, because they wanted to answer these questions honestly, and it was important to them to convey that message. It's important to so many survivors I spoke to, that the knowledge is out, that information is out. But they weren't great afterwards, and there was no support for them. So I really wanted to avoid this. So one of the reasons, so this is a kind of example of a mitigating strategy. Obviously, the people who speak, like Paul, in very touching personal capacity, but are connected to the archive, I knew from before, and we've known each other for a while, but the women in the film, apart from Cecile, but the women from rural Rwanda, and again, that was massively important to me, to have people from outside of the memory discourse, from outside of Kigali, which is really a very different world. We approached them through a wonderful woman to whom a lot of credit has to go. It's called Emilienne Mukansora, who's one of the few therapists working in rural Rwanda, with mostly female genocide survivors and survivors of gender-based violence. And we asked her, do you know people who, in your medical opinion, would not necessarily be adversely influenced by that kind of participation? So we met a number of people with a few focus groups. And then the other side of it, what was really important as well, was the fact that should something happen, because to a certain extent you can't predict it, there would be a support network to somehow deal with it. So that's one thing. And another brief one thing, sorry, I don't want to dominate this, also the participatory nature of this. So the first cut of the film went out to the participants, you know, before it was finished, before it was aired anywhere. And what was brilliant, so Emilienne organized a kind of informal screening for the women from the film, for Oliva, for Claudine, for Adeline, when you, Catherine, mentioned the thing about people presenting, so I was extremely nervous, because, you know, I made a personal commitment to not exploit these stories, to present them in a way that are respectful. So I said, what's going to come back? And what came back was that they really liked the way they looked. And then they were really pleased that, you know, the clothes worked. So actually, something that wouldn't occur to me, but it was really important, the way in which you present yourself, you know, notions, thing, and so on. That's that.
Yes,
great.
That does. Thank you. I'd like to open it up to you now, I'm sure. Oh, we have a very...
We have a microphone. Could we have a volunteer?
What would be helpful is if you could just say your name and where you're from before you ask your question, so we can...
Hola. Okay.
Yeah.
My name is Siraj Rasool. I'm from the University of the Western Cape in South Africa. I think, if it's okay, I think we need to spend a little bit of time on this problem that is all of our problem, of the way in which we inhabit imperial relations of research, and our strategies of mitigating and of questioning of ourselves, and the analytical categories that and hierarchies. You know, this is memory, this is scholarship, and so forth, and who does what kind of activity. and particularly bearing in mind that we are going through, certainly in South Africa, and I know in other countries, an extremely regulatory phase in research with histories of violence, with people who have experienced violence. So that certainly at my university now, it is almost impossible within a year or a year and a half to get ethics clearance in a field such as this. It is almost impossible. And yet, 4 or 5 years ago, a Swiss student came to South Africa to do wrote eventually an award-winning dissertation working with the victims of apartheid. Not a single application for ethics clearance, right? So, and this is the so I'm interested in what the procedures were, because that is one way of mitigating, you know, all of the projects represented in the front. And then secondly, I'm interested in the engagement that would have happened with Rwandan scholarship. I mean, one of my former students is Charles Kabwete Mulinda, who is a major scholar of the experience of Rwandan genocide. And so I'm very interested in what kind of scholarly cooperation there would have been as well, and engagement and critique and so forth.
So we have could we bring the mic down to the front here? We'll take a couple and then respond to them collectively.
First of all, thank you for, I'm Philippe, like Siraj from South Africa, and like Katrina, I was born in Belgium a long time ago. First of all, I would like to thank all of you for this very moving movie. I feel privileged to have been here. I've been many times in Rwanda. It brings all sorts of emotions and impressions. I have a quick question and a comment. A quick question, who will see this movie or this documentary? Has it been on TV somewhere? That's a question. The comment is that this one aspect of the movie I found very important is when this woman with 2 daughters who had no photos at all, then as it happens, when I arrived in South Africa in the late 80s, I became rapidly involved with abandoned children. It was the end of apartheid in Natal, a civil war, and there was a hospital with 70 abandoned children. No knowledge at all who were their father and mother, or brother and sister, abandoned. And I became involved, and 7 of them became my children along the way. So they've grown up with me. They were little, and now they're adults. And I remember very well, and when I heard your movie, suddenly it came back to me, when they were asking, who is my mother? Where is she? The only response I could tell them, which was the same one in the movie, I said, look at yourself. You are the picture of your mother. To try to get them to be resilient, to cope with the absence. So I think this part of the movie for me is one of the most important ones. And I'm glad that you finished the movie with this woman. Thank you.
We'll just take one more question. Okay.
Thank you. Is it on? Yeah, brilliant. So thank you very much. I've really enjoyed the screening and all the discussions tonight. So I was really intrigued.
Sorry, you are?
Oh, I'm Katila. I'm based in King's College London currently. So I was really intrigued by the voice of the interviewer. So could you say a few words of who she is, what was her background, relationship to the people or you, and so forth?
I think there are a couple, if I can pull them all together, yeah, because I think there are some questions there that are very specific to the film. And then we'll come to the first gentleman's question at the end, I think, because that probably relates to all of us. So, the voice of the interviewer and also who saw the movie.
Okay, so in terms of who saw the movie, rather incredibly in an unlikely way, and the film got distribution in the States on national television, so it went out to a big audience. And apart from that, at kind of festivals around the world, what was extremely important to me, and this is part of these kind of mitigating strategies, I suppose, was that the film went back and had a meaningful life in Rwanda. There is a extremely disturbing job, not only in Rwanda, in Africa more generally, that, as Paul said, people come in, take stories, and they never filter back. So we were very lucky to get some follow-up funding for the film, and we took it last June in 2016 for a series of 10 screenings around the country to groups of survivors, some mixed groups of survivors and pardoned perpetrators, at the Reba Center, to youth groups from Nyamirambo. So it had, and we made the effort to get out of Kigali as well and show that film in places where it would be difficult to do that. What was wonderful is that we were thinking about the different barriers that people might have in coming to see such a film. And as both Esther and Catherine point out, so many of them are so kind of pragmatic and almost kind of forgotten in academia as not theoretically interesting. But a small thing like, subsidy for transport, because you need to come and see it from afar, became massive things. So we did that, and the responses were, and another thing that we did was to make sure that the people from the film, everyone apart from Cecile, who was ill, got the chance and do the Q&A and talk about their experience and share their experience of that, to give them a bit more ownership of it, I suppose. The voice of the interviewer, not only does she have a voice, she also has a name. It's Clementine Dusabajambo, who worked very closely with me on the film. To my shame, I'm not a Kenya-Rwanda speaker, so I conducted interviews in English and then conducted the pre-interviews in translation with each of the women, with Clementine present, and then we designed the conversation she was having with the women on camera based on these. And Clementine also interviewed you, didn't she? So maybe you could say a few things about that. And you did a Q&A with her recently.
Yeah.
Okay. She's a fantastic Rwandan filmmaker in her own right. Please do check out her films. Paul, do you want to say a few things about
the process of interviewing with Clementine?
Yeah.
Oh yeah, Clementine, not only she's a good interviewer, but also a filmmaker. She has, I think, produced like 2 films. So we collaborate on a number of things, like providing materials from the archive, and recently she wanted to do something about the Gacaca courts, and we are open, we are ready to help her, and really she helped convincing me to work with Piotr, because she said this is a good project. You shouldn't hold back, and she convinced me, and we worked together, and she's brilliant. Yeah, I would recommend anyone who is coming to work on films in Rwanda to work with her. Yeah.
Okay, if we can return to the first question that came up about inhabiting the imperial relations of research. I mean, I think in a sense that was one of the things that I was alluding to when I asked the question around co-creation of remembering practices or collaborating with remembering practices and what the ethical implications might be. So in part, I think we might have answered that, but nonetheless I'm going to open it up again to see if there's anything else that you might want to contribute. Because I got a sense from your question that you also felt that this was changing. So,
yeah, I'd like to say just a few words. Again, I think it's something we all need to be doing in our own practice is having this self-reflexivity and awareness of what we're doing, our own positionality. But I think there's some really encouraging work going on in terms of processes of decolonization. So there's all these debates going on about, you know, decolonizing the canon, decolonizing trauma theory, decolonizing our curriculum. But again, that's not necessarily co-creating, so it's still very frustrating. But in terms of my own work with Rwandan communities in the diaspora, I'm very much trying to work with Rwandan artists in Belgium, with communities of survivors, etc. But ultimately, the issue seems to lie in the fact of who's able to get the funding. There are still these very rigid structures of academic funding. So I've been very lucky in securing Marie Curie funding from the European Commission. But that raises all these questions around who is and isn't eligible to apply. So I'm eligible to apply as a scholar, as an academic, but the people who I'm working with aren't. So that already, again, puts often the Western scholar in a privileged position. And for example, having to use a certain type of language to write these funding proposals. I'm working with the National Association of Rwandan Communities in the UK, and the chairperson of this community was very excited about my project. But when I actually showed him the written proposal, he sort of looked at it and went, "Well, this doesn't mean anything. This doesn't mean anything to the community. What is this?" But then when we actually talked, and he said, "Okay, well, this is what we can do together. This is how it's really going to happen on the ground." But to actually translate that into getting funding, I think is really frustrating. But also there are initiatives like perhaps Paul, you could speak more to this as well. You probably know more about it. The Aegis Trust has the Genocide Research Hub, where they've got now these they've got pots of money for collaborative projects between Rwandan and foreign researchers, and the aim is very much to help Rwandan researchers to gain access to Western platforms of academic publishing. But again, this is still reliant on this sort of Western, So it's a very great thing to do, but at the same time, it's frustrating.
Yeah, we have in our organization we have a department called Research Policy and Higher Education. The aim of that department is to encourage Rwandan researchers to do to work on topics that are valuable, that are meaningful to the Rwandan society. Like identity, all those topics, reconciliation, social justice, transitional justice, all those topics that are meaningful in the post-genocide society. All the initiatives that we have, we have initiatives that we call Homegrown Solutions, including gacaca courts. As you know, we couldn't try the Rwandan society. We couldn't try genocide, alleged genocide perpetrators. There were more than 1 million involved in the genocide, and you imagine it could take 1,000 years to try those people. Meaning, the people who needed the alleged perpetrators, survivors, would have died without seeing the kind of justice. So homegrown solutions include all the solutions that are from within the Rwandan society, that you can go back in the history and before the colonial period, creative solutions that can help the society to move forward, because these modern Western solutions had failed. We had tried it right after the genocide, and then it had failed. Of course, the ICTR also tried to provide kind of justice, but if you compare, and then the implications, and then the outcomes, and the money that it cost, on both sides, like traditional ones and international ones. You can imagine that's something that you can look at. But that department, research, policy, and higher education, is to encourage Rwandan researchers. And sometimes we have a call of proposals between Rwandans and non-Rwandans. So there are certain amount of money, like £2,500 to a team of Rwandan and non-Rwandan academics. And then they work together, they publish the papers that can be exploited by the government, the NGO, the civil society, and anyone interested. That I think we have also a website, Genocide Research Hub. If you put it in Google, you can Google. We have you can download the papers. You can use those papers, and I think it's useful. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. I'm conscious that we're already half an hour over time, and it's been a hot and long day. So if it's okay with everybody, I think it would be a good idea to draw this to a close. But I wonder if you could join me in thanking Piotr, Paul and Catherine for their discussion this evening, and also Piotr for the film.
Okay, also, can you hear me? Yeah, I hope so. Okay. Thank you very much also from the local organizing committee, again for this wonderful documentary, also for you to be here. And thank you very much to all of you to have stayed until the end, despite of the broken AC. I'm very sorry for that. And it was a great pleasure to have you here, that you've spent all the time with us here, to welcome you here in Madrid. I hope you enjoyed the conference. I hope you could make new contacts, to get new insights, to learn something more, to push further your own research, even maybe a little bit of personal growth. And I hope I see you all in Charlottesville, no? So I would like to thank you also in the name of the presidents of the Memory Studies Association, in the name of the local organizing committee. Thank you very much.